Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey.
Yeah. Hi.
Or wherever you are in the world. What time it is. What time is it in China right now?
5 p.m.
It is
Okay, so
5
good.
p.m.
9 p.m. It's excellent.
This is so weird. So you guys are wrapping up your day. And we're just starting.
Mine is 5 a.m. This time it's good. Usually this workshop is 3 a.m. in
Oh,
Canada.
Oh yeah, right. You're in Canada. 5 a.m. Jesus. Well, if it makes you feel any better, Samane, like my baby woke me up at 5 a.m. today, so yeah, hopefully that makes you feel a bit better.
Yeah.
And he's still awake. So yeah. How many people are on the call? 16. We're missing 2 people. How was everyone's week? Good? I guess that's a yes.
Yeah, we started with all the tutorials. We kind of start with the rhythm.
Yeah, hopefully it's been a busy week for all of you. I know you met Alex for a couple of hour sessions, which is good. And you know, the first week of learning Maya is always an interesting week. So I hope it's been really useful for you. So just a couple of quick administrative points as we're kicking off and waiting for the remaining 2 people. If I'm still, I think it's 2 people. I sent an email half an hour ago to everyone, which is basically a random list generated to create the teams. So we have, I believe, 4 teams of 4. Hopefully everyone got that email, just in case. Let me know if you haven't. I sent it exactly 40 minutes ago. The list of 4 teams, team 1, team 2, team 3, team 4. So team 1 is Xiaoming, Andong, Yingri, and Daphne. And team 2 is Ziyu, Qiyang, Samane, and Yunyu. And team 3 is Wei Peng, Daniela, Yi Yang, and Dingyu. And team 4 is Siwan, Garjia, Yukshao, and Gizem. Right, so I'm sure I got a bunch of names wrong, but I think you know more or less who you are. So yeah, from now on, starting next session, not from this session, you will operate within your teams, especially once you start to present your work back to Alex and I. You don't have to present 4 separate projects anymore. You will present one PDF document, hopefully, with, you know, there can be 4 different directions in your work, or like 4 different types of models in the beginning, but you need to present as a team moving forward. And you should just know your team number, right? Team 1, team 2, 3, and 4. All right, any questions on that?
No.
Okay, cool. Next is just the agenda for today. So we'll spend maybe 45 minutes, 1 hour going through some things regarding cataloging and the idea of components and subcomponents and how we expect you to start presenting some of your work. And then if any of you have any questions from the work you've done during the week, or you want to show us something that is particularly interesting that you've developed, we can go through it for like 15-20 minutes with the whole group, because that could be interesting if there's anything. Although we're assuming most of the week you are trying to catch up with the work Alex has shown you over the last week. And then at 11 p.m. or 1 hour from now, basically wherever, 6 p.m. and 6 a.m., we'll transition to a short workflow session in Maya, where Alex just will reinforce some of the stuff we did last week with him in a short 1 hour session, which is just like a run through the workflow again, to make sure everyone's on the same page with the workflow, so that you know, tomorrow and after tomorrow, as you start to work with your teams, you have another session of the workflow under your belt, so that on Tuesday when we meet, we can see some more results on Wednesday as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Great.
Yes.
Before we start, does anyone have any questions in general, or should we just kick it off? Okay, great. Sorry, my cat is attacking me. 1 second. Okay. All right, let's do this. Alex, could you enable share screening, screen sharing? Share screening.
Should be okay now.
Yeah, thank you. So what I wanted to talk to you about today is just similar to how Alex is going to reinforce the workflow. I want to reinforce 3 things today. One is some ideas again on the procedural modeling. So hopefully at this point you've done some of it yourself. So some of the stuff I'll show today you've seen before, but it means more to you now that you've seen it. Some other stuff is on the ideas of cataloging, and I'll show you some work there and how we expect you to present some of your work. Alex let me know that he shared a kind of visualization setup with all of you in Maya, right? Like a quick render setup. In the past, we've had a lot of students just take screenshots from Maya in their booklets and their presentations. That's never a good idea. It doesn't age well. It's better for you to invest the time to use that setup to visualize anything you're presenting back to us or that you'll be putting in your presentations, all right? Okay, great. I'm just gonna open 2 documents so we have them ready. And also, you all got examples from the previous teams. I'll also be sending out at least one more booklet today for all of you to take a look at. So the main thing I want to talk about today is, again, the way we expect you to present your work. So at this point, I think you're all familiar with the concept of procedural modeling that you see here on the screen, which is the one Alex took us through last week, which is you follow a simple set of geometric steps to create complexity in your geometric form. And the main thing we would like all of you to start your presentations with is this idea, right? So we do expect the next time we meet you as teams is that the different parts of the team have already started to work through these concepts of procedural modeling and are able to present back to us the basic, 4 to 6 step process, which takes you from a simple geometric component or a simple geometric primitive, like a cube or a plane or a pyramid or a tetrahedron, and follow 4 to 5 to 6 very clear operational steps. So, like Alex showed us, that could be subdivision, that could be deleting of faces, that could be extruding or bridging or cutting faces. All of those count as good operational steps, as well as transformational steps. What I mean by transformational steps is things like duplicate and move, duplicate and rotate, duplicate and mirror. These are all acceptable transformational steps, right? So we will expect each team to start to talk to us about how they're going from a simple geometric primitive. And in this case, the geometric primitive doesn't matter as long as it's a clean one. So a cube or a plane or a tetrahedron. Don't model something crazy and call it your primitive, right? That doesn't work. So how you're going from the primitive using operational steps and transformation steps to get to what you are considering a meaningful procedural modeling catalog, right? And that last piece that you have at the end of that sequence is your idea of a component, right? So that's basically what you're seeing in these slides. Again, you've seen them before, but like here, for example, which is also acceptable, you have a team that chose to work with 4 primitives as their starting step and just using bridging, which you've seen with Alex, to bridge between the four faces of the cubes to create this kind of connected shape. And then they're using simple scaling operations on the edges to create this final shape that they consider their core component, right? And so again, this is a different example. You can choose to start with one geometric instance or one geometric primitive, or you can choose to start with multiple geometric primitives as your starting step for your procedural catalog. There's no right or wrong. Your team doesn't have to spend a long time making a decision. That is something I want to make super clear. Sometimes in phase one, a lot of teams feel that you have to have a lot of conversations about what the team is doing. You shouldn't have that pressure. The best way to work is just do the work, put it in your PDF or your presentation, and present it back to Alex and I with your team, and we'll discuss the merits or what's good or bad about each idea. And then eventually we start to narrow down your work to one idea, right? So don't feel the pressure that whatever you decide over the next few days is final. That's not the case at all, right? In fact, it's probably not even going to be in your project. It's just the starting steps. But it's super important because you need to start working as a team. And very importantly, also learning to present and catalog what you're working on rather than just showing us Maya files. Right, and I'll just go over this one really fast. It's again exactly the same steps. They started from a geometric primitive of a cube. There was deleting of faces and extruding of edges. So this is actually a bad catalog because they've combined two steps into one step. So you guys know how to do this now. They deleted faces and extruded edges in the same step. That will make it very confusing for anyone trying to follow your process, especially in your team. So make sure your catalogs are as clear as possible. But then, they have, again, you can see it's just 7 steps here. And it's basically, cube, delete, extrude, mirror, merge, merge, mirror, mirror, right? So it's all operations, And what's important about this slide is they've shown stuff in plan and elevation and axonometric, right? So it doesn't have to be an accurate axonometric. It just needs to be a perspective view from Maya. But it's always a good idea, and I'll show you more examples, to show the multiple views in the same slide because it shows the complexity of the geometry you're generating. A lot of these geometries are not simple to understand, so showing them in as many views as possible is useful. So sometimes, showing it just like this in perspective is good, but you want to have a few slides that break down your geometry in different perspectives like this. So this is an example from one of the workshops last year as well. This is one workshop Alex and I taught again. So this is one of the teams that did quite well. This was their beginning steps. So again, they didn't do the catalog very well because they already skipped some steps to get to this stage, right? If you guys look at this component, can you see my mouse?
Yes.
Okay, so they basically had, ignore the frame, that was more of a diagramming device. They had a cube and they did extrude of all 6 faces of the cube to get to this shape. And then they deleted all the faces except the outer faces. And then they bridged between those faces to get this kind of geometry. And then they deleted the faces to get these tunnels, right? So very simple operations: extrude, delete, bridge, delete, right? So nothing complicated, nothing too fancy, very clean geometry, which is exactly what we want to see from all of you in the next couple of days. And then what was interesting is they made 4 different stages of the same component. So if you look at this, can anyone tell what's the difference between red, yellow, green, and blue? Does anyone have any idea what's the difference between those 4?
The bridge connection is different. Sorry? The bridge connection is different.
Yeah, exactly. How is it different?
It's just like connect with a piling with different faces.
Exactly.
So
yeah, perfect. Exactly. So the red one is a bridge between these perpendicular faces here. So this one and this one, that's how you get that tunnel. And then this one and this one, that's how you get that tunnel. So it's literally just 4 bridges, right? And then the yellow one, they just reverse the order. So instead of going this one and this one, they went this one and this one. And then the green one, it's this one and this one, right? So basically they just switched the sequence in which they did the bridging, and effectively they didn't have to change their procedural modeling steps, but they managed to produce 4 different types of the component, right? Which again is a very interesting way to work, to show that you don't have to produce too many geometric steps to create a lot of different things, right? So in this case, they were from a cube, they went to this component, and just by deciding in step 3 who to bridge, they could generate a whole different set of catalogs, right? And I'm just gonna skip slightly forward in the presentation because I wanna show you what the correct way to present something like that is, right? So this is a completely different project, but this is a very good way to present that kind of logic, right? That it's called like a family tree or a decision tree, which is if you deviate from this family, you get this sequence of geometries. If you deviate from this family, you get this sequence of geometries, right? So it's like opening up options based on what you're doing. So you can see that here. Basically, at step 3, you could produce very different families based on the decision you make in the tree. You see what I mean? So then the next thing they did is they started to mix the families. So I know Alex has shown you how to do this using instancing. So you can see they started exploring how to mix just the same family, right? So green with green, they mixed red with red, but then they started to play around mixing green and yellow, red and yellow, yellow, blue, green, blue, right? And they didn't go crazy. They just started with 2 to 4 components being mixed, right? And this is a very important step Alex will take us through today, which is, you don't want to go from one thing to 100 very quickly, right? Most of the intelligence of your system, most of the behavior in your system, and most of the discoveries you'll find will happen at the step where you're playing between 1 to 10 units, right? You're trying to figure out what's happening at that scale because that scale is very easy to understand, right? When you're playing with 100, like I'll show you in a second, it's impossible to understand what's happening, right? It's too much complexity for you to understand. But when you start to look at 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 units, you can start to examine what's happening, right? So again, this was a very important step. What I like about this page is it's a simple catalog of 1 connection per object. And that connection could be between you and your same family or you and a different family, right? So this is basically going from here to here is just a catalog of single connections, right? So again, you're not adding too much complexity. This is what we really like about this workflow, which you just add 1 or 2 simple ideas. So here they added the idea of, okay, we're gonna connect 2 objects, that's it. And then the other idea was we're gonna connect 2 objects of the same family or 2 objects of the different family. And just by doing that, you could produce catalogs, right? The next step was they started to work towards, on the left, can anyone tell what's the difference between what this is and what this was? What's the difference here?
The view.
And, yeah, and what about in terms of operational or transformational steps? What's different?
An aggregation of through the replace object.
Yeah, so if we use the language we were just talking about of connections, what changed?
They create a pattern in there.
How?
But dividing to the colors.
So
together.
kind of, yeah. So what happened is this was a catalog of single connections. This was a catalog of 4 connections, right? So the only thing they changed was they're like, okay, let's scale up to 4 connections. And the complexity increases exponentially, right? Because here you could only mix 2 pieces together. So you had the choice of, which one is yellow, which one is green, which one is red, which one is yellow. But when you have 4 connections, like you said, you can have patterns, right? Because you can say, okay, I have 3 blue, 1 red, 3 red, 1 blue, 2 red, 2 blue, right? So you exponentially increase the number of options, right? Which is why this idea of a family tree keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then at this point, it starts to get very complicated, right? Because now you have 16 connections and you can really create interesting patterns, right? So you can see how even in just 2-dimensional studies, in 5 minutes, you can go from a cube to a component, from a component to a family of components. And from a family of components, you can go to pattern studies, right? So this is what we expect to see of you. You have to stay very controlled. And it's not because me and Alex are control freaks, but it's because using this method of thinking about design, we can edit these changes very easily if we decide to go back. And you could talk about these things very easily, right? So for example, this would be a catalog of 4 connections between the B and R family, right? The blue and red family. And you could describe this one as 2R, 2B. You can describe this one as 3R, 1B, right? If you wanted to be even more crazy, you can, say this is location 0, this is location 1, this is location 2, this is location 3, and start to describe these catalogs in very interesting ways, right? So a lot of you would have seen a lot of this kind of work in the computational parametric world. And this is how you start to do this kind of work, right? If you don't have control in the beginning, it's just going to become a mess, right? And at this point, these patterns become really, really interesting and complex, right? So if you want to go up even again, you can start to see how they would produce these really, really incredibly high populations, right? So 1 second. I'm just going to share my screen again. So you could start to see how they get to really, really, really high populations, right? So what's the advantage of doing it like this? It's quite clear because they now know very easily how to create these massive assemblies of objects, right? They know how to go from essentially this page here with these kind of medium scale patterns. So this is what we want to see from you guys. Like we said, 2, 4, 8, this kind of mixing is good numbers to see from you. But then you can see how they went from here to here in a couple of weeks, right? It's very understandable how they did that. And if you look at their book, which I'll send you later today, they did some really, really interesting studies, which were they also used encloth, but they were able to describe very clearly how they were mixing these families to produce these larger populations. And eventually they got to some really, really large populations, right? So this was what they were considering medium level, right? And what was really interesting about this project is they understood how to mix these geometries at a really interesting potential, to the point that they knew that if they mixed it like this, they could curve the body like this, just using the encloth, right? For example, this was a 3D print they made, right? Just through the mixing of families. And then they went to what they considered high population, which was thousands of these units, right? These were thousands of the component. But again, they could tell us very easily how they did this. And they were very able to mix these units very quickly. And all of this just came out of cube, bridge, delete, 4 families, and mixing, right? It was all based on that very simple procedure. And they could get these incredibly complex geometries based on those simple operations, right? And I think in the end, they tried to make an architectural shape where they made this plate, again, of thousands of units. They distributed the different geometries. And then based on that, they got something that looks like a shell, right? That they 3D printed, right? So an incredible amount of control, all starting from, just this page, right? Their whole project. They spent 2 weeks just on these studies, right? Figuring out how to make the catalog work, how to make the behaviors of the units. But once they cracked that, to go to this scale was just 1 week, right? Because once you understand the behavior at the medium scale and the low scale, a low population, it's very easy to go to these high population studies, right? So I think this is a really clear example of the power of procedural modeling and this kind of procedural duplication operations. Does anyone have any questions before I move on? Great. So hopefully that's all clear. And like I said, I'll share their booklet after the presentation. So this is just another example of procedural modeling. I think you've seen this enough at this point. Again, just presented in different views, right? So this is a bit more complex. It's just a whole series of extrusion and bridging operations. But again, it's plan, elevation, and perspective, which is important. You've seen this before. Again, based on the operations, what are the potential families you can come out with? Why this one is interesting versus this one, for example, is this was based on the mixing of components. This one was based on the duplication of the same component, right? So they had exactly the same piece here, and they just mixed it in very different ways, instancing it and duplicating it in different ways, which got the very different geometries, right? Versus here, this is the different component, right? And then again, just mixed in very different ways using instancing and using instancing and rotation and mirroring. And sorry, it's the same thing here, different component, different results, right? So they were using a lot more mirroring, rotation, et cetera, to create their geometries. And it's the same thing here. This is not from a workshop, this is from someone's studio project, but it's the same idea. This is how they were presenting a catalog of rotations, right? So their unit was very geometrically dumb, let's call it, right? So there was no intelligence in the unit itself. It was a very dumb shape. It was just a cube cut in a very interesting way. And then they just, like a Rubik's Cube, they were very interested in how they could rotate these different parts to create these different subcomponents that they could mix in different ways, right? So they started from a cube, they cut it in very different ways, and then they mixed them in very different ways. So for example, if you mix purple and orange, you get this. If you mix blue and cyan, you get this, etc., etc., etc. So what I'm trying to say is there's very different ways for you to think about the operations between modeling and transformation that you can use to produce your initial component studies, right? There's a lot of options here. And then, yeah, this I showed you already, how you can present how different decisions come out based on the different parent you use. Right, and then these are just examples of cataloging again. So in this case, like a plan catalog, and like again showing different parts of the procedure. So this is just like examples of how we expect to see your catalogs. And this I think Alex shared with you before. Did you, Alex?
I haven't yet, but yeah, this is like a test of like what we're looking for in this workshop, essentially. Like this is somehow the direction that we're exploring versus the old one. Yeah, so again, the geometry here is not necessarily what's important, but you can see how Alex did this. He has the different, he has a single component, which we can't see here, but he mixed them in different ways to produce the blue and the yellow and the purple family, right? And then you mix them together to create interlocking, and then you use the inflation to create these interesting opportunities between the interlocked things, right? So even though the geometry looks very complex in this study, it's actually the same exact logic as this, right? There's a parent geometry, and they're mixed, and then they're mixed together in a population. And then the only difference is Alex used inflation in an interesting way to create these interlocked geometries.
Yeah. So this was just a quick walkthrough of some of the steps we expect to see from you. And like I said, I'll also share this presentation so all of you have it in PDF form so you can refer to it if you want. I'll be sharing this booklet from this team as well as perhaps one other, which I'll show you in a second. I'm just going to stop sharing for a second to pull it up. That essentially are really good examples of this workflow. Is that clear to everyone, or does anyone have any questions?
I want to ask whether this combination is random, or there are some reference or limitation, or there are some series of book I can look at to make some reference.
So the references we'll send you, like I'm saying, I'll send you these documents. So it's very important to understand they're not really random, but like we're saying, it's based on a very simple idea, right? Like you will play around in Maya, right? There's no easier way to describe it. That's what you'll do. And based on that, you'll come up with your components. And then you start to use very simple operations like mirror, rotate, flip, which is the same like mirroring. And then you'll start to figure out ways to combine them, right? So let me try to show you another example, because I know this is something that confuses a lot of the teams in the beginning, which is, trying to understand how do I make my first decisions, right?
Yes.
So I'm share my screen again. So this is another team's presentation from last year. So this team, again, they struggled a lot in the beginning to come up with their geometry. But in the end, they had a very simple way to do their initial component. Can anyone guess how they started this component? It's actually, the diagram is there, but if anyone knows that. This piece, this yellow piece up here, does anyone have a guess how they did it?
A tube and deletes 3 surfaces and bridge them.
Yeah, kind of. So they did it even simpler way. They had 2 cubes in the opposite corner of a cube. They deleted some faces and they bridged, right? So again, this team didn't do such a good job in presenting their catalog, because that should be clearer, right? Like, this is a problem we had with this team. So you can see it kind of here, right? They had a cube, they moved the cubes to the corner, deleted the faces, and then just bridged. That gray shape is bridging, right? And based on that bridge, they got this tube. And again, depending on where they put the cubes in the corner of the big parent cube, they just got 4 different orientations of the tube, right? So again, there was no, to answer your question, they didn't have any reference. They were just trying very different ways of figuring out how to start the project, right? And that's why I'm saying over the next 2 days, if there's 4 of you in a team, we expect to see a couple of options per person. So, you can very quickly produce 8 to 10 ways to generate the component, and then we can sit down and talk about them and say, okay, this one is interesting, this one maybe stop working on it, right? So that's what I'm saying. Don't feel the pressure that your first decision needs to be very smart. It's just that you're starting out, you're playing with different ideas, and you're presenting them in a very, very clear way, as clear as possible, so that we can talk about it with everyone and choose what to go forward with in your project. So don't be pressured now to make such big decisions, right? And for example, this was just another way of doing it, where they put cubes in all the corners and a cube in the center. And again, just using bridging, they got this kind of geometry, right? So you can see what they started to do was just playing with how many cubes to put in the cube, in the bigger red cube, and who to bridge. They could produce these kind of snowflake items, right? You see that? And this was a confusing diagram, so ignore it. It's basically they unfolded this red shape, right? That's not the clearest thing. But essentially what's really important in their project is 2 cubes, bridge. 9 cubes, you get that, right? 3 cubes, you get this. 4 cubes, you can get this. 5 cubes, you get this, right? It was, again, very, very simple decisions. How many cubes, what position, who to bridge, right? And then, you know, obviously they started mixing these red cubes to get these complex patterns. I'll just skip ahead, right? And then they started to mix these geometries, right? These were different ways they were mixing the geometries. Again, not the very clear diagram. This is not a good example of a catalog because the information is so small, you can barely see it, right? So I just want you to keep attention to that. And again, they just started to mix a lot of these results, right? So you can now see that purple, yellow, and blue were just very different versions of these studies, right? Purple, blue, yellow, right? So the only difference is yellow was all the corners used and the center, and blue was only 4 cubes, and purple was, I think, only 3 cubes or something like that, right? So it was very simple way to generate their families to produce these kind of mixtures, right? And you can see the rest of their studies were just trying to explore the behaviors that come out from mixing these geometries, but they worked at a very high scale very quickly, right? So we don't want you to work at this high population this year. We want to focus more on the medium population and more geometric interest in what you're doing, right? So, but you can see just the kind of results they could get based on the mixing of their families, right? Okay, so let me just go to the beginning. So again, you know, these are just examples of how what we really care about from this is only up to, you know, maybe up to slide 10, right? It's like these beginning steps, right? How do you mix these geometries is super important. It's the same like here, right? These first steps are really, really important, right? Like they call it component exploration, connection strategy, right? And then starting to generate these patterns. Right, so this team did a much better job of cataloging the decisions they made. So it's very, very easy to see how they were thinking about the project, right? All right, great. Any questions? We're now at 45 minutes. Is it clearer? Like, I really believe this is super important. Like, you should not be worried about how to start. You shouldn't worry about, oh, does this make sense? Is it right? You know, we'll talk about that 2 weeks from now, right? But for now, what's really important is you're doing your geometric exploration followed by your simulation and encloth explorations. So I just want to make sure all of you are not feeling nervous about that, and you're feeling comfortable with that idea of how to start your explorations. And again, Alex will walk us through an example workflow. So you can see, like, again, like there's nothing right or wrong about this piece, right? But what's clear about it, if he, you know, he can show us, you know, what was the basic component and how he generated it. There's just missing 1 or 2 steps here. You would easily understand the rest of this, right? So let's put it this way, clarity of what you've done is more important than anything else at this stage. The ability for you to tell us how you went from the geometric primitive all the way to your component, and then from the component all the way to a family of components mixed together in an interesting way. That is very important to show us. And then we'll start to look at evaluating them based on using encloth, right? So for now, what's really important is that first sequence I described. Primitive to component. However you do that, whether you do it like this, or like this, or like this, or like this, doesn't matter, right? All these different methods. And then to go from component to pattern has to be also super clear, right? So that's the first step for all of you in your learning, which is this idea of design as research, right? So there's no concept yet. There's no, like when we were in undergraduate, all of us, you were expected to start your project with a concept, right? Like my concept is a house based on the idea of a pattern of a tree, right? A lot of us had this kind of stuff, if you remember, right? That's not how we work, right? This is the idea, the nice thing, but it's a bit challenging of doing design as research, right? Which is you have a very simple idea and that takes you to something complex, right? What is your idea right now? My idea is I'm starting from a triangle and I'm deleting a few faces and bridging them to get to a component that I believe interlocks really well on the x-axis. And based on that, I can produce a family of components. And using the aggregation instancing based on mirroring or based on rotation, I can get to this family of components. And then this sub-assembly can interlock with another sub-assembly really well, right? And basically, I just described this workflow. That's your concept, right? So again, can you tell me it's right or wrong? Not really, but you can tell me, oh, that component doesn't mix well with this one. Won't it be interesting to try generating your instance pattern based on this logic? And why don't you try mixing these two families? That is a more meaningful conversation. And then finally, when you start to use inflation and things like that, we can start to evaluate the behavior of the parts. Okay?
Yeah. For me, it's much more clear now to which is the logic in the operation and in the modeling process. Because I tried to create my own components, for example, yesterday, and create an aggregation based on some patterns. And it was really difficult at the beginning to find the starting point, to find which was the more logic way to use an operation, which is right or wrong. So I felt that
I think that's
play around and do whatever till I find.
That's great. I do think that's the right way to do it. And now that you see this, it's immediately clearer to you how to do it a bit better. And that's perfect, right? And that's the whole point of why we're doing it in this sequence, because you get to mess around a bit, you get to play with Maya, try to accomplish what Alex showed you, and then start to understand, like, okay, just messing around in Maya is not going to give me a project, right? I need to start to think about this a lot more logically. And that's what we're showing you today, how to think about this in a logical fashion. Do you want to show us what you did, just out of interest? Don't worry, you don't have to like. Yeah, sure, you can show us.
Okay, yeah, good. You can see my screen.
Yeah. So do you want to focus on your,
yeah, firstly, I started from something maybe silly. I started to find a way of a packable geometry, as Alex told us. And I thought of the, I would like to, I tried to find the logic to pack geometries, and I thought the scales logic, the scales manner, and I packed some cylinders. No, let me find the prototype. Oh, I can't find it right now. So I started to doing something like this, and then just playing around with this cylinder to trying to create something which looks more like a scale. And it was like this. I didn't like it at all. It was a total fail. So then I tried to find something more that seemed more logic.
Just press F.
Yes, and I tried to mix some cubes. And then maybe this makes more sense. Sorry, 1 second to find the starting point. Yeah. yeah, I use this cube. I changed the edges here. I started making these things. I didn't like them at all. And then I think that this component seems more
Yeah. Yeah.
logic.
No, that's good. That makes
Mhm.
sense. So,
Mhm.
I think now you can see like the difference between working like this and working like the procedural steps. Because, for example, like if you look at the stuff you did in what you were calling the scales, that will be impossible to describe to someone, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of
And
mixing it by hand.
I realized that, and I tried to make more structured, more articulated way. Yeah.
Right. And this is already a good step forward because you're like, okay, that one is impossible to describe. And if I asked you to present it in the same way I was just showing you today, you wouldn't be able to do it, right? This one is already a bit better because you could walk us through how you went from a cube to this kind of shape with the pointed faces. I would say that, even the decision of how much to pull up that face needs to be considered, right? Like, so again, it's repeatable and it should be like a factor of the scale of the cube. And then the only other thing I would say is like, don't be afraid that your initial component can be very simple, right? Because like this one is right? So let the complexity come from the families. So already the one you have selected is much better, right? It's so much less complex. And you could see how you could generate it in a much cleaner way already, right? You just need to put
this is just a better.
Maybe you just put 6 cubes, delete some faces, you do some bridging, you'll get the same result, but even cleaner and even more controllable, right?
Yeah.
And you wouldn't need all these edges, right? Because can you zoom back in on that model, the one you had?
Yes, and I tried also to combine them, but it wasn't really a success.
Yeah. So here, you see how you have, zoom in for a second. You see how you have all these unnecessary edges?
Yeah.
So again, if you saw the stuff I was showing, there's a minimal amount of geometry required, right? And a lot of times you do this because you want the shape to look interesting, right? Like you want it to bend inwards so that it looks a bit more like, like a certain shape. Don't worry about doing that because again, the shape is not what's important so much. And in the future, those extra geometries will cost you a lot of time, right? Because once you have 10 of these mixing together, it's going to get a lot more difficult to understand, right? So I think this is a great first start, and it shows that you're working through the problem. And I hope everyone has tried stuff like this, because now that you've tried it and then you saw this presentation, you understand the difference, right? How to take your thinking one step forward, and that will change and make your life much, much easier.
Yeah, for sure.
Perfect. But yeah, that's great. Then I really appreciate you sharing. It's the right way of modeling. I think if this is the first time you've used Maya, that's good progress, great progress. And the modeling is clean, the packing is good. Like I said, we don't want you to go to such high geometry this time, but it's good that you're already playing with it and starting to see the potential. That's great. Is there anyone who wants to show anything? Or should we move on to the workflow? Feel free to share. There's no pressure. Like Daphne was showing. It's just initial studies. We'll move forward now to something different as you start in the way I just showed you and the way Alex will show you. So there's no pressure if you want to show anything. Okay. No worries then. Okay, great. So hopefully I feel like this morning session made things a bit clearer. I'll share the PowerPoints with you when Alex is finished. Of course, as usual, Alex will also share the video recordings of the session. So hopefully those are useful as well. And so let's get started with the Maya session. And at the end, we'll also schedule the next sessions for the coming week. All right. So I'll hand over to you, Alex.
Okay, so guys, let's. I'm actually going to just replicate one of the models that we were seeing today, so we can just look see how that looks. Share this. So for now, I'll delete these. So we will start with something that's like a simple cube, and we will have a matrix of 3 by 3 by 3 for replacement later on. Let me just delete the enclosed elements. So we were looking at this component, I think, in the beginning from one of the teams, which was a very simple component. So basically, you would take your cube, go to face mode, then you shift, right click, extrude, and we take those faces in by clicking the one of the boxes on the gizmo to activate the scaling method, going in, and making sure that the keep faces together is off. So let's keep it like almost uniform as we can. After this, we go to face mode, then Control Shift I. Oh, well, when this happens, when you try, sometimes it's connected to the history. So you might need to delete the history of the object before you're able to invert the selection. So you just go to, like we were saying before, Edit, Delete by Type, History. And now if you can try Control Shift I, it doesn't work. Go back to Object mode. Hover, go to Face mode. Control Shift I, it works. Sometimes it's a bug in Maya. I don't quite know why, but it will happen. So we can delete all of these extra faces. And now we have these smaller squares that we can start connecting with, let's say, 3 components in this situation. We go back to object mode. We'll copy this 2 more times with Control D, moving it over. Control D, move it over. And for example, we can start by connecting pairs of faces, whichever ones you like. I'll start like this. So we go to edge mode, double click to select the full naked edge loop. And then we can choose the adjacent one here with shift and then double click. And then shift right click to bridge. And that's one successful bridge. Then we can do the same for, let's say, this pair. And then the same for this pair. So you see, like, I've created something that's a bit too wide because they're starting to intersect. So what I'm going to do in the other ones, I'm just going to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So if you go to this one, go to face mode, select all of them, shift, right click, transform component. So it's not in the top rollout menu, it's down here. So we can just kind of make them smaller just so we make sure that this doesn't happen again. So again, we can choose the scaling method. And then from the middle scale, just take it in until it's a bit smaller. Go back to object mode. Let's delete these 2 and we'll create the copies from this one. So we make sure that every connection connects to the same edge length. So again, edge mode. Double click to select the naked edge. Adjacent edges with shift, double click, and then bridge. Oops. Doesn't work. Maybe it's the history. So again, select the object, edit, delete by type, history. Edge mode, double click. Oh, I can see why something happened here. There we go. I had that dirty geometry. Always check, like when you turn on your vertices, you might see that something is wrong. So for me right now, there was like a stray vertex inside of the face. So if I bridge this now, it works. Let's try to bridge the other ones. It works. Okay, so that's a full connection. I can copy this out. Let's say in this one, I'm going to remove these. So shift, so you click, shift, and double click. It will select the full loop like we were discussing before. And then we can delete these. So we have a base geometry again. So in this one, let's connect a bit differently. So go to edge mode, double click the loop, double click the adjacent loop, bridge. Then we get this one, and we bridge. This one, and again we bridge. And in this one, let's bridge somehow this one here, bridge. So we're bridging the neighboring ones. We're not bridging the adjacent. Okay, so like that's 3 types, let's say. This one is basically a rotation of another one, but it will still work nonetheless. So now we have our matrix of 3 by 3 by 3. We can copy it out, move it to the position here, let's say. And with the replacement of object, the first thing we want to make sure is that the gizmo is in the correct place. Because you can see as I was copying, the gizmo for each cube is somewhere else in space. We want to make sure that it's in the center of the cube. Because when we're replacing a geometry, we're taking the positioning of this one and putting that one in the same position. So in this case, let's say if these 2 cubes have the gizmo in the same place, these 2 would fly here instead of where they're supposed to. So the way that we can make sure that this doesn't happen is by selecting all of these objects, pressing space and holding down, going to modify. And then first we're going to center the pivot. So now we know that each cube has its own center. And then we're also going to freeze transformations. It should be fine. Let's see. Let's see if we grab, let's say, these 4 cubes, or many, and modify. That's perfect. So that's what I want. So in order to do this, like I think we covered it in the session as well. Just for the ease of your own understanding of how this works, I will not use copies. I will use instances, so you can see kind of a live link between your object here and whatever's happening in this aggregation, let's call it. So let's select a few cubes, whichever ones. And then after you've selected the ones that positions you want to take, you select the object that you want to replace with, which is this one. And then in modify, in the replace object, you go to the option window. And you make sure that here, the type of copy is not a copy, but an instance. And then you apply. So now, if there's something happening with this one, something will happen with the rest here as well. So let's continue doing this for other elements as well. So in order to, because our last command was replacing the objects, we can just press G, place them again, then get these, replace with this, maybe a few more with this, a few more with that one. Okay, so that is how it looks. So I think now you can kind of see that there's not like a full connection between these. Sometimes they create these separate members. This might also work. It could be interesting to see whether you can kind of make it still stick by making sure that things loop around each other. But for example, if we wanted to create additional connection like I did in these elements here, we can do that now with the object live linked to its replacement geometry. So we would go to our first object, press F to focus. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove these faces, because this face, because it's connecting to some neighboring face, might become a lamina face, which means that once it's merged, you'll have like a faulty geometry because there will be 2 faces, one on top of another. So the first thing we're going to do is just remove these. Okay, we got all of them. And then you delete. You can see that they're updating in the aggregation as well. Now we're going to switch to edge mode. And then in edge mode, shift, right click, and go to insert edge loop. So once we have this tool, we can either, try, oh, well, for me it's already on, but we want to kind of create a uniform split of each edge. You can do it either with the multi-cut, like we did in the previous session, or let's say in edge mode, if we do the insert edge loop, we can also check in tool settings, which is here on the top right corner, how many equal multiple edge loops we can make. In this case, it's 2, which is why it's split in 3 parts. So basically, this is what needs to be checked. You need to have multiple edge loops and use equal multiplier. In this case, it's 2. So when I click here, it actually splits it like in thirds. Click here, do the same. Click here, do the same. Now that that's done, we can step back to face mode. Press Q to switch to selection. We select this face and that face, and we can bridge them. So we can now see that there's a connection being established between this element and this one, which were separated before. Again, face, an adjacent face, you bridge again. More connection established. So you can kind of try to control how much connection you have by doing this and checking what's happening in the aggregation. We can do the same, let's say, with this one, F. Go to face mode, get rid of the faces that will become lamina faces, which is your original squares. You got them all. You delete. Step to edge mode. Select an edge, any edge. Shift, right click, insert edge loop, and then start clicking away. Just hovering above the edge until you can kind of do this. Then we go to face mode, press Q for selection. And we select the mid face in all of these. Then we go to shift, right click, and then extrude. With this extrusion, instead of, you can kind of scale it in a little bit. So you press any of these little cubes and then use the middle one to scale like this. But then after this, I'm going to hit R to scale them all together rather than one by one in its own like local scale. If you press R, you'll be able to unilaterally scale them in like this. And then you need to delete these faces. So now we want to fuse these together. And you can already kind of see if you step into vertex mode, there seems to be logical pairings. This, this, and this. So 1, 2, 3. Then shift, right click, merge vertices, merge to center. And then you repeat the operation on this one. Oops. There you go. And then another pair of 3. 1, 2, 3. G again. 1, 2. G to repeat. 1, 2, G to repeat. And we have a full object that's fully connected. So let's just grab these. Let's see how it's progressing here. It looks okay. And the last one we want to address is this one, the central one. Let's go to one mode. So we go to faces. Again, we delete the lamina faces. Okay, we got all of them. Delete. Go to edge mode. Shift, right click, insert edge loop. 1, 2, 3. When we go to face mode, you can press Q to go back to selection. Hover, right click, face mode. Face, face, adjacent faces. Shift, oops. Shift, right click, bridge. Select adjacent faces, shift, right click, bridge. And we have another connected element. Okay, so it seems that like your group here is sort of ready. Everything seems connected. We can select all of these, press Control D to duplicate, W to move over, take it up a little bit because these are underneath the plane, which is visualized here as this net. And then we press space, hold down, go to mesh, and then go to combine. So we bind everything together in one object. And at this point, I think it would be a good idea to just go to edit and delete all history. So delete all by type and delete history. This is still absence. In this one, the last thing we need to do is merge, because we want these faces to merge fully around the loop. So we press space, hold down, edit mesh, merge. And it's fully merged right now. So if you were to double click, everything is connected. But this level of connectivity, like I was saying, can be controlled simply by choosing what you want to connect and not connect in here. You can break these connections if you like and see how it reflects on the aggregation here of 27. So for example, now when we have all of this together, let's say this can go to something that looks like a bit like this through the use of inflation. So what we want to do is first seal these elements. So if we select this object, because our object is so simple, like it ends up with this open tube here that's essentially a quad, we can easily fill this later on without sealing every element separately. So we just select the object, press Shift, go to Mesh, and then Fill Hole. And there will be a quad added everywhere for you to kind of seal this element. Now we're going to duplicate again, move it over, and add some more subdivisions, because as we were discussing with simulation, you cannot afford to do a simulation on a very low poly mesh because it just won't simulate properly. So you select this, go to polygon modeling in your ribbon, and then go over until you find this kind of square that goes to multiple squares. It's showing it here. And then you get something like that. And we can do that once more, just see something a bit more smooth like this. We select this, go to edit, delete by type history. And now we're ready to convert this into an encloth. So we select, yes?
Sorry, why was it important to delete the history?
Sometimes Maya can get a bit confused. Like history in general means that the object might be a bit less stable. Sometimes it will crash, sometimes it will act in like unpredictable ways. So it's usually it's just usually good practice. Nothing might happen, but something might happen. So I kind of choose to sort of circumvent that issue by deleting the history before creating an encloth, or deleting the history at one point when your object no longer needs it. Like if you don't really need these steps, you might as well delete the history and keep the scene a bit lighter. Also, as you accumulate history in each object in the scene, especially if you have like, let's say 100 or 200, 300 objects, it's actually a lot of information being stored in the file. So the file will become also heavier and less stable. So that sometimes it's good to kind of clean out the history and just have like a cleaner version of your working space. So now that we can turn this into an enclosure, we just select the object. We switched our FX tab from our, well, for me it was rendering, but usually it will be in the modeling tab for you guys. So you go to FX, you go to enclosure, and you can create an enclosure right now. If you scroll down in your outliner, which again, if you don't have it, it's in Windows outliner. You can see that we have a nucleus or a solver and our enclosure attached to this element. So if we go to our enclosure and then go to the attribute editor, we're going to, instead of doing a minimal surface like we were doing on Tuesday, we will be looking into something that's called pressure. So if I'm going to close all these tabs, when you press your enclosure in outliner, in your attribute tab, you need to find enclosure shape. Well, and then for me, it's 1, but it can be anything depending on how many more you have. What you want to do is navigate to a pressure tab here and increase this pressure to, let's say, 2. Just see how that holds up. Then you rewind to the start of the animation and you play. Okay, so we go back. We can also choose to ignore gravity for this exercise for now. So in dynamic properties, if you scroll down, you'll see that there's something called ignore solver gravity. If you check that and you play again, it will not react to the gravitational force. Let's see what it does. All right, and go back. If you want something a bit more, let's say, dramatic, the stretch resistance right now is what is preventing this enclosure from kind of expanding a bit more freely. So if the stretch resistance obviously is lower, that means that the fabric is more likely to deform in some way. So if we, let's say, let's put it at 5 and just see what happens. This part, like the simulation, requires a lot of tweaking. Like you need to see what works for you. That's kind of looking more like this. And the only other thing that I would make sure that you do, you can see right now, this is something that we don't want, like this kind of intersection or like a self-intersecting surface defeats the point of doing the simulation in the first place. This is because the collision flag by default in Maya is set to vertex collision, meaning that there's like an imaginary sphere around every vertex and they're trying to kind of negotiate. But once this expands, it gives like the opportunity to the face to slip between neighboring spheres and create these kind of intersections. This is like less computationally costly, which makes the animation or simulation run faster, but it's less accurate. So we want to, if we want to avoid this, we need to go to our collisions. And in the self collision flag, instead of the vertex flag, you need to switch to a vertex face flag. And now rewind. And now when you play, you'll see it's a lot slower. It'll take some time, but if by pressing escape, you can stop the simulation. I'm not sure if I ever said that, but it's quite useful. If you take a look now, you can actually see that there is no intersection. Like it's handling this inflation quite well, and it's giving us what we want in terms of like not having self-intersecting surfaces anywhere. So this is, let's say, the output in this case. And obviously, as you kind of change these elements and you make decisions about connections or directions of flow or even how you replace them in disaggregation, this should logically kind of give you different results. So you can see, like, I didn't really replace the same elements, so these already kind of look a little bit different in terms of like this element does not exist here, it's more broken down. So the last part would be kind of how to visualize this. I think I just kind of briefly introduced that the last time around. So in order to kind of cover that again, to visualize in My 2020, which I'm now asking all of you to use, in your render tab in the viewport ribbon, usually by default it's in viewport 2.0, but you can switch it to Arnold. And right now it will be black because there's no light in the scene. So in order to introduce light into the scene, you need to go to your FX and then switch to a rendering tab. And then hope that Maya doesn't crash, which might happen. Okay. Then you go to Arnold. And in light, there's something called sky dome light. Dropping a sky dome light will basically give you like this occlusion type material that kind of looks like Arctic mode in Maya, sorry, in Rhino. We also want something on the base so that we can see some cast shadows. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a plane, press R and just scale it up. Like that. I'm going to make this plane white so we can hover above the plane. So then right click, hold, and assign new material. And in your Maya, there's something called standard surface. This material is what Arnold works with best, and then we can have it as white. And then we want to, let's say, display the edges on this object like we're displaying on this one. In order to do this, oops, I think my computer is struggling a little bit. Okay. But for now, I will pause the render just to kind of not struggle as much. So in this case, we select the object, again, right click, assign new material, again, in your favorites, there's a standard surface. Click that. And in your color, there's something called base. In this color, you click this little flag here. And you need to choose from your Arnold tab something that's called wireframe. So if I type in wire, it will show up. So we click that. And if we play the simulation again, now you can see the wireframe. By default, it's on triangles. We can switch that to polygons in order for it to be quads. And it will look like this. Unfortunately, if you put it in smooth mode, it will visualize, yes, I do. It will visualize the sub-polygons as well that are used for smoothing, so it will get a little intense. So I think it's okay even to keep it in one, even if it's a little bit edged. And now, for example, if you want to kind of edit this material, you no longer know where it is. One way to access it is through using the hypershade. Hypershade is something that sort of works like the material editor in Max for those who use Max. So if you display your elements in the hypershade, you should be able to find one of the, I think the last one that I applied should be, yeah, exactly. So standard surface 4, it is good practice to just name them. Let's just call it something, so that you can actually find it easily in the hypershade in this kind of window where you can choose the materials that are available in the scene. You can now play around with this if you like. If you want to create something a bit more interesting, I usually use metalness to introduce some reflections into the element if you like, but it's up to you how you want to do it. I think it's just the simpler you have it, maybe just like a white on black wires is already enough. And then you can use this to kind of either render out or take screenshots, which will be a bit more pleasing, I think, in terms of like taking like documentation. You can either take it directly from the window or in render settings, which is right next to your hypershade. You can kind of set up in your common tab, you can set up a resolution. Let's say that we work with pixels. I'm going to turn off my Arnold renderer for now. So stop it. We can maintain width and height aspect ratio, which is basically, you can choose HD TV. Let's go for full HD. Yeah. 1080 by 920. And then you just need to render that, right? So you go to your rendering tab. And then you also can access lighting, texturing, and shading here. But what we want to do right now is you see this eye here. If you click the eye, you will have the render view. And if you just hit this film thingy here, you can render the current frame and just wait for it to render out. And you will have like a higher quality image that you can control the resolution on. Yeah, this is reasonable. If you want to introduce like higher quality rendering, you can as well. It's either you create a bigger resolution render, or in Arnold rendering here in the second tab in the render settings. Usually if you kind of increase the camera AA, which is anti-aliasing, let's say to 6, and I'm going to add some on diffuse. These like camera diffuse, specular transmission, SSS, and volume indirect is all of the like say elements of a material or a light. And if you increase the samples, sort of, you can kind of predict that it would give you like a better render. It just means that the rendering time will be a lot longer. So kind of pick and choose when you need to do this, because sometimes for like very small catalogs, even something that has a little bit of grain would not be a problem.
Yeah, exactly. Like if it's part of a catalog, don't worry about it being high resolution or anti-aliased. If it's something that's taking up half a page or 1 or 2 images per slide on the presentation, then yeah, please just make sure it's a bit higher quality to this, because this render time is under 45 seconds. So for like it being on a page on its own, that's worth it. It being part of a catalog, like a 3 setting is more than enough.
Yeah,
what's more important is you just select a clear view, like we said, like a nice perspective view and a nice plan or elevation view to make sure everything is clear, and gives you a good canvas to start diagramming in Illustrator or anything like that.
Yeah. So basically, this will be a bit of a higher quality one. I'm going to stop it now by pressing escape. You can just see that the noise has sort of been removed, which you can, let's say, if I put it up here, you can see that even, you know, as you look, there's a bit more noise here because it's just trying to give you like the fastest possible render. And now as the cycles go on, it will start removing it. But I think like this is, yeah, this is maybe higher quality for the bigger presence on the page, but usually it would be more than enough to just use whatever you have in your
Yeah. The only thing I would say also, Alex and everyone, is that, you know, like in projects like these, if you want to call out certain components, using clear shades of a single color or very contrasting colors is the best way to do it as well. Because, you know, you should take white images like these because they're the most, let's say, visually attractive, but they also show the geometry in the cleanest fashion as well, especially with these lines, the ISO lines that Alex is showing you. But for diagrams, you know, you can color in Maya already, so you don't have to try and go color things in Photoshop, which usually looks really bad. You know, introducing the different families using color is your best option. Definitely the material render shade or even the ISO line color. But let's say for now, like the easiest way to do that is just the shade of the color of the component.
And that obviously, like I didn't do it for the other one, but you can change this to any kind of color, like the white color can be anything else that you like for it to be. And then that can be like a very good notational tool that you can use always. So I hope that kind of clears it up. The recording will also be there for you to reference if something was too fast or was not very clear. Let me just see. There's something in the chat. Okay. All right, I think that's it for today. I will send the recording of the session itself as I usually do. I will paste it into the Google Calendar, so where you have your Zoom link, you'll also have the recording to the cloud. I think that we're kind of good. Are there any questions? I actually think someone emailed me about a question. I'm not sure if it's within our group. So if you have any questions regarding modeling or whatever was happening on the screen today, please feel free to do so now.
Mustafa, I have a question about what we need to do. So how further in the process do we need to go for Tuesday? Is this more of like an exploration step, or should we extend it to like a further step of combinations? And
yeah, so that's what we should talk about now in terms of schedule. So today is Saturday. You were introduced to your teams today as well. So, you know, I know you have a Maya session with Alex on Tuesday morning as well, right? That's right, Alex, right?
Yes.
And that is running, just checking the calendar now, 8 to 9:30. So, you know, we could do a session from 10 to 11 on Tuesday, I would say. Does that work? Yeah, Tuesday 10 to 11, we can do a session. So it's still early enough for everyone in China, right? That will be around 7 p.m. Is that right? So that would be fine. And Samane, that's much better for you. Hopefully that is around 7 a.m. And at that point, we'll just do 25 minutes, or sorry, like 15 minutes per team. And what we expect to see from each team is very simple images showing the initial studies from geometric primitive to geometric component. That is the bare minimum we expect to see for Tuesday. It will be good that you start to show us how the component can start to aggregate, or how the component can create different families of the component. So that is what we expect to see on Tuesday. You don't need to go much farther if you don't want to. If you have time, you can start to go all the way up to the workflow Alex showed you today. But just to be clear, we don't want you to just show us random Maya files. We want you to take the effort to catalog it properly and share it with your team ahead of time so that there's one PDF that each team brings to the table. And we look at it for 15 minutes per team. All the teams will participate, so you can look at each other's work and comment on each other's work. And I think we'll start like a central repository, so all these PDFs can be saved, so we can see each other's progress as well. So to answer your question, Tuesday at 10 UK time, we'll send an invitation after Alex's presentation. One PDF per team. Those PDFs have to have bare minimum as many ideas as you want of the primitive to the component, and then ideally component to family.
Okay.
I would also suggest, like, because now you have teams, immediately sort of set up SharePoints within the team so everyone can access the files. In the past, it's usually been Google Drive. I mean, if you have other options for that, Dropbox or whatever, feel free to do so. But the team should already have sort of a central server for all of you to access, where you have like a clear file structure, so that when we do get to these presentations on a weekly basis, you always have like a PPT ready or a PDF or something that we can quickly run through, and you can also share with us so that we can have insight into your progress. Because it's been happening in the past years also, like at the point of the presentation, people are like, oh, you know, the files are there or not there, someone else's computer. Just set up like a central server for all of you guys so that you can access it at any time and share it with us easily. I think that would be just kind of like a organizational note more than anything else.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, any other questions? Okay, great. So hopefully now the workflow is becoming clearer. The ideas to start the workshop are becoming clearer. Like we said, you know, me and Alex don't know where you guys will finish. That's the whole point of a workshop. You know, we're just as interested to see what you are going to do as you are. We don't want it to look like last year. We want it to be very different, actually. So, you know, this, I think we'll just share the same beginning styles, but then from then on, you all will be pushing the workshop in a very different direction. So that's something I'm quite excited by. So yeah, and you know, Maya is becoming a bit more of a handleable tool for all of you. So yeah, hopefully next week is a bit more creative than last week for everyone. And yeah, so see you on Tuesday, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions over email. You want to send us anything you want an opinion on, feel free to do that over email. Otherwise, like I said, one PDF per team, please. And we will go in the order of team 1, 2, 3, and 4, starting 10 a.m. on Tuesday. And we'll share a bunch of material after this, starting with the recording, and then I'm just going to PDF these PowerPoints, send them over to you, and feel free to use them as reference material. All right. Thanks, everyone. It was great seeing you all again, and see you in a couple of days.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye bye.
Thank you.